Hi, I'm Lavallo, and I've been to every country in the world. Today we're going to talk about the hardest visas for me to get. Even though I travel with an American passport, which is one of the strongest ones, we get visa-free arrival to the majority of countries, I still know my fair share of days spent applying for visas at embassies, filling out paperwork, and trying to convince consul generals and begging with them to please stamp my passport. So now I'm going to share the hardest stories of getting visas. The first story I'll share is of a place that now you can just apply online as an American, but when I was looking to go, it was complicated in a lot of ways, and that is India. I went for an internship in 2012 when I was 21 years old, and I wanted to get paid for the internship, but it wasn't through my school. So the embassy didn't know if they should give me a work visa or an education visa. Neither of those worked, because for education, you have to go through a school. For work, you need to be paid a certain amount and be sponsored. So they ended up giving me what's called an X visa, which basically just means here's a visa. It's not for any specific reason. You can open a bank account, but that's it. They told me the embassy in Abu Dhabi had only ever given 2 of those out before. I was number 3. Next door to India is Pakistan, which is another visa that was hard for me to get. I went for work, so theoretically it should have been kind of easy, but as an American, there's a little bit of complications between the 2 countries and getting a visa. So I went to the embassy with an invitation letter from the person I was working with, and the man looked at my application and saw that I was a young American guy and said, okay, come back in 3 weeks. But the business needed me to come a little bit sooner than that, so there's a few calls that were sent, and I ended up being told I could go back the next day because some strings were pulled. When I got there the next day, I say, hi, I'm looking for my visa, and the man says, didn't I tell you to come back next month? And I said, well, I think that this person called for me. And he looked at me shocked, and he said, you're the one that they called for? And I was like, yeah, can you? So he's like, fine. So he starts filling out a visa, and I needed a 6-month multiple entry visa because I was going to be going in and out for a long time. And he hands me a 5-day single entry visa. And I look at him, I'm like, but this isn't what I applied for. This isn't what I need. And he says, tell your friend that. South Sudan was a really interesting example. It has a conflict right now, and so there's not many tourists who want to go. There are a lot of journalists who want to go, but they don't necessarily want journalists to go. The government infamously announced a couple years ago that they were going to start charging people like $10,000 to get a visa because they knew that the UN and WHO were going to send people anyway, so they could pay whatever they wanted. They ended up changing that rule. So I was in Nairobi, I went to the embassy, I give all of my forms, they say, okay, come back in 48 hours. I come back, and the second I walk in the door, the woman picks up the phone. When I get to the window, she says, okay, you need to talk to the consul general. So I go in the back, they lead me into his big office, and he has my passport, and he's just flipping through it. And he said, why do you want to go visit South Sudan? And I said, I'm trying to go to every country in Africa, and I have these friends that I want to meet. And he just starts shaking his head. He's like, I'm sorry, you need a good reason. And he shuts the passport, and he puts it down. And this is, one of my last 10 countries to go to. I see the whole trip flashing before my eyes. And I look at him, and I'm like, okay, I need to convince this man to let me go. So I'm like, sir, I know that it's a complicated time, but I would really love to go, and I would really love any advice you could give me on how to stay safe and have a good time in South Sudan. And of course, that works really well, I think, when you smile and you ask people for help and you tell them that they're smart and able to assist you. And so he picks up the passport again, he starts looking through it, and he's like, some journalists go and they pretend that they're tourists. And I was like, oh no, I'm, because I'm not a journalist, so I'm not lying. I just wanted to see my friends, and he's like, some people, they want to go to the rebels and talk to them. And I'm like, oh my God, I would never want to do that. I really just want to see Juba. Tell me what would be good to see. I convinced him that I want to go just for tourism, which is true. That's all I wanted to do, and that is all I did. So he gives me the visa. I go, and I have a few days in Juba with my friends. It was a really fun time. Eritrea is a country in the Horn of Africa. and it has one of the more strict like entry requirements for visitors. It's one of the least visited countries in the world, but it's really fascinating. It's a beautiful place, so I really wanted to go. It was an incredible process to get the visa. They ended up sending it to the Abu Dhabi embassy and not the Dubai consulate, and so everybody was confused because they thought it was sent. I thought it was received. The consulate didn't have it. It was this enormous like conundrum of people, like everyone thinking they had done what they had to do but nothing actually working. I got really close to the consul general because I was going to the consulate every day and saying, hey, is it ready yet, is it ready yet, and asking him about the country. It was just a really long process, but totally worth it because I ended up having a great time in Eritrea. Nauru was another place the visa was a little bit complicated. Technically it looks somewhat easy. You just have to send an email to the immigration office and they'll get back to you and send in specific forms, but it ends up being a little bit more complicated. Nauru only has 10,000 people. There's one guy in the visa office. If he's on vacation, you don't get a response. If he forgets your email, you don't get a response. You have to constantly follow up. Some of the forms that they ask for are completely strange. It's the only country in the South Pacific that Americans need a visa to, and they definitely don't make it easy for you. Another place where the visas were very hard and complicated for me to get was throughout West Africa. So I did two big road trips, and all throughout this, I had no visas before I landed. So I would go in the country before the next one and try and get the visa. That presented a string of like weird events. When I was in Gambia, I was trying to get a Sierra Leone visa and the consul general wasn't there. So they ended up like calling his cell phone and he came just for me to stamp my passport, which was very nice. At another one in Gambia, they ended up giving me half of the cost of the visa because we started talking about religion and the Quran together. So he thought, I shouldn't charge you the full amount. He gave me half. The Guinean visa that I got in Bissau, I had to have this long discussion with the consul general, and once he found out what my job was, that I do a lot of like education strategies for different companies, he was asking me about like a school that he wants to run, and we ended up having this like business discussion for a long time. I've never been denied for a visa, I think, and why I say I think is because one time I wanted to go to Turkmenistan, and I got an invitation to go to Turkmenistan, and I was gonna get a visa, and I went to the embassy here in Abu Dhabi, and they said, okay, like come back in 3 days. I said, okay. So I went back 3 days later, and they said, oh, like we needed to see your Uzbek, like where I was going next. We need to see your Uzbek visa first. I was like, okay, well, like here, they hadn't asked, so I showed them that. And so 3 days later, I go back and they say, oh, sorry, it was actually 3 days from when it's received in Turkmenistan. I'm like, okay. So now my 2-week trip is down to 1 week. I go back and they say, okay, it's going to be approved tomorrow, Friday, in Turkmenistan. But because we're in Abu Dhabi, the embassy won't be open until Sunday. But if I would have left Sunday, that would mean I'd have 4 days to go between both Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. So he said, okay, we're having a barbecue on Saturday. You can come to the embassy and I will give you back your passport. I said, okay, thank you so much. And I go to the embassy on Saturday and I'm like knocking on the door, and this man who I hadn't seen before, like the guard, he's like, we're closed. I'm like, oh, but the guy told me to come back. He's like, no, we're closed. Come back on Sunday. And he starts screaming at me, and I like can't convince him that I was told to come, and like it was just this awful like language barrier. And then he ended up like not giving me my visa, and I ended up only going to Uzbekistan for those like 4 days, which was supposed to be 2 weeks. And I ended up going to Turkmenistan like a couple years later for a really nice visit, which was more easy to get the visa that time. But so maybe I got denied, I have no idea. The hardest visa for me ever to get was to Libya. It was supposed to be pretty straightforward. I was being invited by a friend, and they said, okay, it'll take a few weeks, call me a few weeks before you want to go. I did that, and literally everything that you could possibly think of that could happen to delay a visa happened to me with Libya. First, there was, a lot of, you need extra papers, you need this translated. Then it was, okay, there's 4 men who have to stamp your visa to allow you to come. And this guy doesn't show up to work this day. Then he passes it to the next guy, and he's on holiday for a week. And then this guy never comes to work. And then finally they say, okay, we have your visa approved. They send me a copy of it, but it must be sent by diplomatic wire from Tripoli in Libya to Tunis, Tunisia, where I was going to pick it up. And this ended up taking 3 weeks because electricity problems, and I don't even understand why. But basically, they just refused. They wouldn't send it to the embassy for me to pick up the visa. And I was waiting every day. I thought it would be that same day, and I bothered my friend so much because I kept asking, like, what is going on? Like, this makes no sense. Finally, they say, okay, it's been sent. So I go to the embassy, and the man who stamps visas isn't there. So they say, oh, he might show up like later today, or he might show up in an hour. We don't know. So I sit in the embassy literally for like 8 hours, and he never comes. So the next day I bring my friend with me, and we're sitting there with the same people, because there's other people waiting for 8 hours, and they keep saying, okay, he might come in an hour, or he's not going to come at all today. And if he doesn't come today, it's the weekend. You have to wait like 4 more days to get your visa. So we leave. They tell us he's not coming, and we walk out. And luckily, we can't get a taxi. We're like standing on the street, like trying to figure out where to go. And somebody else walks out and says, hey, the man came and he just gave me my visa, but the embassy is closed. So we go to the door and we knock. We're like, we know that you're in there. And they finally open it. They take us upstairs, and we beg this man. I've been waiting for like 2 months now. I end up getting delayed for a month, having to hang out in Algeria, which was awesome, but frustrating. And finally he stamps the visa, and I don't think I've ever been more happy to receive my passport than I was that day, to finally, after 2 months of like constant frustration, to see my Libyan visa. I left the next day to go to Libya, and had an awesome time with my friends there, and that was definitely the hardest visa for me to get and the most frustrating experience. I want to make a couple quick disclaimers. So one is that there's a handful of visas that are normally hard for Americans that were easy for me. So those are because either I was working in those places or because I was traveling as a guest of friends of mine. So for example, Saudi Arabia and Syria and Bhutan are 2 places that are often expensive or impossible or difficult to get to. But because I was invited by friends of mine from school or from work, or because I was going for my jobs, the visa process was really easy. For a lot of other travelers, those are some of the most difficult ones. There are also a few countries that are really easy for Americans to go to, but are really difficult for people from other countries to go to. So 2 of those would be Equatorial Guinea, which has visa on arrival only for Americans and nobody else, and then Central African Republic, which has a similar visa on arrival policy for Americans, but for almost nobody else. So of course, different travelers at different times, they'll have troubles with different visas, different processes that they have to go through. But this is my story of the hardest visas that I had to get. I hope you like the stories of the hardest visas for me to get. I'm sure you'll like tons of other videos that I have, so subscribe down below. Follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. I have tons of photos there. So reach out to me. Let's chat about lots of stuff. I look forward to hearing from you.